the new year, I believe. And we are absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Megan Dwyer Baumann, who is from the Women's World Banking Group. She is qualitative research lead there, and she has come here today to talk to us about Ukrainian women refugees' financial health and use of financial services in Moldova and Romania. So it sounds quite specific and quite niche, but I think there's going to be a lot of learning to carry through to other areas that we're interested in here at CHASM, and those areas that I know you all who have joined us are interested in. I'm just going to say a little bit more about Megan first of all, and then I'll hand over to her for a short presentation before the usual then question and answer session. So Megan holds postgraduate degrees, MS and PhD degrees in geography from Penn State, and she previously worked as a legal professional with forcibly displaced persons. Her research expertise includes how low-income households and communities respond to social, political and environmental stresses. She's trained in feminist methodologies and intersectional approaches to research. And of course, she's doing this fascinating piece of research at the moment, which we're really keen to hear more about. And I was just telling Megan about Oslam's work and the work that we're doing in CHASM also around the financial needs and experiences of Ukrainian women refugees. So thanks once again, Megan, for joining us. It's over to you if you'd like to go ahead and start sharing your screen.
Sure. Thanks so much, Dr. Overton. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Let me share my screen with you. Great. All right. Get everything set on my screen. Perfect. Okay. So thank you so much for the welcome, the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today. I am the Global Qualitative Research Lead at Women's World Banking, and I'd like to thank Dr. Okdam Young and all of you for inviting me as well to share this work. Today I'm presenting on behalf of my team members and my co-author, Dr. Sonia Kelly, who's the Director of Research and Advocacy at Women's World Banking. And I would invite you to add your questions to the chat while I'm presenting. I always feel like if I hold them till the end, I forget them. So feel free to toss them into the chat, and then that will enrich our discussion after this presentation. So Women's World Banking is a global advocacy-led organization focused on bringing about the conditions for women's security and prosperity through formal financial services. We work directly with financial services providers, governments, and international organizations like the UN, World Bank, and other standard-setting bodies to make this happen. We are an advocacy organization, but our research team is really the engine behind our policy and our advocacy efforts to ensure that evidence-based work is really driving everything we're doing. Our research team is a 7-person team based all over. A few of us are in the US. I'm calling in from Chicago today. Some of us are in Nigeria, in India, and in Jakarta, in Indonesia as well. So today I'm sharing the bit of the working paper that's now under review for peer review. I put a link in the chat so you have access to it. This is part of a broader effort by Women's World Banking to work towards more secure and prosperous livelihoods for forcibly displaced persons and migrants. Today I'll be using the term refugees loosely, and Dr. Overton noted that I have a legal background, so I understand that, and since I'm among many academics, defining terms is important. Refugees is often a legal term used. I'm going to be using it today in our research instead of using forcibly displaced persons to mean people that leave their countries and cross borders due to a threat or an event that is harmful to them. So the goal of this research is to influence policymakers and also the social sector. So last week, we were invited to present this work for the regional gender task force that's coordinating the response for Ukrainian women refugees. And so this is, we're really lucky to get moving and to the point where Dr. Overton get IRB approval really quickly to get this moving right after the war started. And so we're really excited to be able to contribute to ongoing, really practical and applied conversations. I'm also excited to present this today, as last week we kicked off 2 new studies that are going to make this into a longitudinal research effort, both in going back to the people that we surveyed and also continuing conversations through interviews. And so we're excited to pull in women that are now in Poland, as well as continuing in Moldova and Romania. And I'm happy to chat about that and hear your thoughts in the end after this. So in the next few minutes, I'll introduce our research, focus in on findings relevant to financial inclusion, financial resilience, and livelihoods. And I'll discuss how the data we collected last year directs current efforts among our team and among our general collective interests in supporting Ukrainian refugees. And then I'll close with some thoughts to jumpstart our discussion and questions. So in the weeks following the first Russian attacks on Ukraine, we watched as hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian women crossed borders into nearby countries. And while there are numerous groups of refugees confronting financial and livelihood difficulties globally, the gendered nature of Ukrainian border crossings was of particular interest to Women's World Banking for what it might teach us about other refugee women and international responses to help them. So really importantly here, while this is about Ukrainian women, for us, it is a way to talk about and learn about how to support refugee women who are receiving less media attention, less international support, and yeah, just putting that up front. So let's keep that in mind. It was estimated in the months following the Russian invasion that up to 90% perhaps of border crossings were women refugees and their dependents. And furthermore, in those first weeks, there was significant concern among the financial services community about Ukrainian refugees' access to banking services in arrival countries, as well as women's ability to exchange Ukrainian hryvnia into euros or other currencies. Ukrainian women left their homes, their communities, and their jobs, and a large number left the country. And while we don't know exactly how many women are living outside of Ukraine right now, we do know there have been about 8 million Ukrainian refugees recorded across Europe alone as of earlier this month, and there have been 17.5 million border crossings out of Ukraine, the numbers coming from the UNHCR. So most women have reported intending to return to Ukraine, given the inability of their male family members to leave the country and just a hope and desire to be home. In early April of 2022, our organization mobilized funding to conduct research to examine women's changes in livelihoods and financial resilience, asking about their short-term and long-term needs as they moved into safer countries. Refugees attempting to open bank accounts in receiving countries or countries where refugees resettle, we use the term receiving countries, face barriers created by multiple forms of required identification and proof of address, documents that are really difficult to obtain for refugees and migrants who are moving around. After a few months of these challenges, the European Central Bank issued a letter to the members of the European Parliament laying out a scheme that guaranteed hryvnia at Ukraine's official exchange rate. In turn, the European Banking Authority authorized banks to provide accounts to Ukrainian refugees with alternative forms of or delayed confirmation of identification. This was really big, and I'll come back to this later. So despite this improved access, we know that people don't enter the formal financial sector without reason. And our research explored the drivers of and then impacts of women's engagement with financial services across their journey. Our overarching objective was to understand the financial lives of forcibly displaced women during and across their journeys, and our central research questions gathered information on women's needs at the time, their household income changes, use of various financial services or strategies, including informal strategies, in their journeys, and then we briefly touched on longer-term needs. We designed this research around the concept of financial lives, and we understand money management to touch important aspects of all of our lives. So I come from my trainings in environmental resources, and now I work in financial services, and I think this is, for me, has always been really important that if we ask women about money and about their resources that they're using, this touches also on their jobs, their health and their medical care, their housing, their educational needs, their ability to be mobile, and their future options. So today in our time together, and then you use the word financial inclusion. But we really feel like it's important to clarify that we know that financial health or women's economic empowerment are not ends to themselves, but part of a really greater process of women's lives and health. And I feel it's really important to be explicit in saying this, that we're using these research to examine overlapping and intersecting job, well-being, and family needs of women refugees in Moldova and Romania. So limited research has addressed the financial inclusion in relation to refugees and other forcibly displaced persons. And a number of scholars have traced refugees' financial journeys, both informal and formal, and revealed that financial vulnerabilities are highly contextualized to the social and legal vulnerabilities of refugees. Wilson and Cristalli found money and financial services to be an entry point of inquiry to the resources, relationships, and risks that refugees face along their journey. And this body of research demonstrates that refugees' journeys require a complex web of formal and informal financial services to facilitate material and security needs along the way. These studies also highlight the legal barriers that refugees face, including restrictions on financial service access, labor market restrictions, a lack of access to social support. Our investigation advances knowledge and applied research on refugees' women's financial needs, access and use of associated banking services, and looks at the financial resilience of refugees. So financial resilience, for those of you unfamiliar with this term, is a framework to define and look at how an individual or a household, how their ability is to manage day-to-day funds, to take advantage of opportunities that arise, and how they're able to respond to emergencies. So strong financial health is easier to achieve with a range of formal financial services, but women and men, that's our hypothesis as an organization, of course, but we find that people also leverage informal financial services. So like savings groups or loans from family members, of course. And then we also are using the term of financial resilience, and this comes from people looking at financial vulnerability. This is my one concept that's like very academic, and then we'll get on to the fun stuff, but this is like the form of our framework comes from financial resilience, which comes from vulnerability, and then Lusardi et al. In a paper work on financial fragility. And this is where the like Findex question comes up on measuring whether someone could come up with 1/20th of their gross national income per capita, which in the US is about $2,000. I should have done the exchange for y'all, $2,000 in an emergency. And by this metric, we can show that people, even in like financially included areas like the US, financial fragility is really high. So then financial resilience is measuring kind of the opposite. And this is from Lusardi and Clapper. And so we're using that in this research. Okay, so we chose to survey refugees in Moldova and Romania for a few reasons and based on assumptions that we made. So let's be explicit about those. Our organization's focus is on low-income women. And we thought that perhaps women with less money would be crossing borders directly into neighboring countries. Second, in the moment of deploying this research last April, Russia had declared an offensive focus on eastern Ukraine. We thought that perhaps those leaving the country via road would head first to Moldova or Romania. At the same time, aligned with our focus on policymakers' responses, Moldova had recently applied to join the EU in March, and Romania was already part of the governance of the European Central Bank, so we were curious if there would be any changes there or differences. We intercepted women at 3 border crossings in Moldova and then another 3 in Romania, including at train stations, which were points of arrival, and then we went also to refugee centers and refugee camps to survey women. The geographer in me is like kind of embarrassed to show you this very rudimentary map, but also like thrilled that we have a map to show you. So this represents the women who participated in our survey, that they were from all 25 oblasts in Ukraine, which we were really surprised about to find. The darker ones being where most women were from. And of course, you can see like the oblasts surrounding Moldova in the south. We had a lot of women coming through there. But this was really interesting for us because we could see that while we had assumed people would be crossing directly into Moldova from surrounding oblasts, really people were coming from everywhere. And now as we go into the next phase of this research, we're curious to see if women are coming from like different places in Ukraine. To put numbers to things that we all know to be true, I want to share some of the income numbers from last June. Again, as I present this, it's so strange to think that so much time has passed. So I'm really, again, we all want to know kind of where women are at right now. But the numbers serve for us as a bit of a baseline. So over 1/3 of the women we surveyed were between 35 and 44 years old, the large majority being of working age, more broadly understood. 43% reported being the primary household earner in Ukraine prior to the war, with an additional 13% saying that sometimes they were and sometimes their partners were. Of those surveyed, 1/3 had full-time employment prior to the war, 13% with part-time employment, and then an additional 18% were self-employed, either full or part-time. So thinking about how the war changed livelihoods, again, things that we all assume to be true, 88% answered generally that their incomes were lower than early February 2022, with 75% reporting receiving zero income since then. And again, not surprising, these numbers solidify how gravely the war and displacement affects livelihoods and household financial security. Okay, so jumping into the findings, I've organized them into like 4 sections. So one on livelihoods, corresponding then to financial resilience, financial services usage, and then thinking through in an applied way, the policymakers' response. So livelihoods. I present this slide with like these tiny numbers of women who had wages, again, to really illustrate the context. We were speaking to women as they were leaving Ukraine, or for those who had been there for a few months already. Again, like very few had been able to find paid work. So for those who had found work, it was mostly inconsistent. Last June, for example, we spoke with an older woman who was previously a medical professional. She had found hourly pay in a greenhouse. She earned daily wages paid out in cash at the end of the day, and it was available, like whenever there was available for work, she called her, but it wasn't every day. Another woman, a hairdresser in Ukraine, had rented a chair in a local salon in Moldova, and she had used online services to like order all the supplies she would need. But these are few stories among the 805 women surveyed. At that time, only 40 responded they had income. And when asked in another way how they would cover an emergency response in the next 30 days, fewer than 1% said that they would do so through paid work. In-depth interviews suggested a few reasons behind these numbers. Number one, women had just crossed the border, either an hour previously or maybe in the last few days. And second, and most importantly, for what I'm presenting today, women had numerous needs that they needed to meet before they could even think about work. So in one of the interviews, I really appreciated, a woman was like, I can't think beyond today. Like, please don't ask me about how I'm going to find work or like pay for groceries. Like, I need to find out where I'm going to sleep tonight. So again, giving the context of like when this research was done. Among survey respondents, more than 60 were traveling with children. More than 20% were traveling with parents, and then many with both children and parents. When we interviewed women and asked about their experiences looking for work, they noted that they were looking but hadn't found anything that would work for their families, or that they had just arrived and intended to look for work but hadn't found where their children were going to go to school, and so they didn't know where they were going to live, and then they didn't know what location they could look for work. Another woman traveling with her elderly mother and school-aged child said she first had to figure out what hospital that could continue her mother's chemotherapy treatments. And then maybe if she could somehow manage, she would look for a job. In a third story, a young mother in Romania had arrived in April and found a position working in a factory. And she said, well, it works for me because I have a really young child. The factory gives us housing and the child can be there with me. So again, this isn't surprising because dependent care is a general need for women across the globe. But I think really important to show that refugees especially encounter some particular challenges like payment for childcare. There's a lack of family structure around oftentimes. And again, this idea of mobility, like where am I going to be? I'm not sure where my kid can go to school. I'm not sure we're going to find housing. And so looking for work is really difficult. So this is like one of our key findings and takeaways. I think really important for the financial services community too, which sometimes forgets or can forget about the contextual lives of refugees, that livelihoods are intertwined with and contingent upon other needs, such as housing or children's education. The needs first to be met for Ukrainian women, refugees, were housing, medical needs. Those that did have housing were really concerned about how to pay for the utility bill, managed separately by a utility company. We spoke with women who had been in Romania and Moldova for 2 or 3 months, and we asked if they were looking for work, and like some were staying in university housing, but then students were going to come back in the fall and they needed to move again. A lot of people at that point were really hoping to return home, and they didn't want to look for work yet. So our data indicates too that livelihoods in the sense of finding formal employment or opening one's own business are tied to uncertainty and the temporality of being a recently arrived refugee. So other cost needs among the sample included medications. While the receiving countries have similar medication availability to Ukraine, sometimes getting medical care to procure a prescription was logistically difficult, in some cases life-threatening for really severe things. Our sample cited insulin needs, blood pressure medication, and other needs for their own or for their dependents. Advocates of transgender rights pointed out social and cultural challenges for people in gender transition, getting the medications they need, which were critical for their transition trajectory. And then finally, I mentioned enrolling children in schools or daycares was a logistical challenge, taking up time that would otherwise be spent looking for income. We talked with people who were trying to set up bank accounts, but then they needed a translation or authentication document, and procuring that was also a difficult task. So all these things, like if anybody's moved to a new country or spent time in a new country in this room together, will understand that like everything takes so much longer in a place that you don't know, and especially not speaking a language, which would be the case in Romania, not in Moldova. Okay, so moving on to financial resilience, it worked out for us that the Findex came out right around the time we were publishing this paper. So we have really remarkable data from before and after the war. So we're able to nearly directly compare a representative sample of Ukrainian women with the sample of Ukrainian women we engaged as part of this research. And what we found was, again, not surprising to all of us, but like really concerning when we look at the numbers. The percent of people who could reasonably come up with emergency funds totaling slightly less than a 1-month paycheck is about 20 percentage points less than it was before the war. In fact, nearly all Ukrainian women we talked with said it would be difficult or impossible to come up with such funds in the next 7 days. And for a population that at that time intended to return home at their own expense and rebuild their houses, many of which had been destroyed, this is a pretty concerning picture. So the Findex was collected in 2021 and then released this year. For those people in the audience unfamiliar with this data set, comes from the World Bank. And then we were asking the exact same question, but in May. So this change is like pretty stark to see. And so when women said like, we're not gonna be able to come up with funds in the next 7 days. And then we asked the same question in the next 30 days. And most people said it would be really difficult. And again, looking at like where women are getting financial support from. At that time, they were using their savings. Now we're really curious to see, have people used up all their savings? Like, do these 23% of people we interviewed, do they have any savings left? A lot would ask for family and friends. A few people were receiving money from family members in Ukraine. Most were sending money home, especially to men who are still there. And then some would say borrowing, but yeah, people were like, I'll look for a job, but I don't have it yet. So this is, again, like a snapshot of financial resilience and health. Like people at that point had it maybe a little bit, but various thinking now what we'll find in our next rounds. And we wanted to know, our research question also was about how women manage their money and their household finances across their journeys. So 84% had paid a lot of money to leave Ukraine, whether in train tickets, paying someone to drive them out. 13% that we interviewed were in debt because of the cost of travel out of Ukraine. And a lot of them, again, like planning to go home, and they would have to pay for that themselves as well. Of the interviews we did, which were only 16, but a bunch of women, a handful of women we talked to had ongoing debt from Ukraine that they were still trying to figure out how to pay off, even as they left. All these things that we perhaps don't think about when we think about the like day-to-day expenses of refugees. And then again, kind of over and over again, women saying, I need to find clothing, I need to find food, I need to find where we're going to live, and I have to figure out how to get back home. So how well did financial services support women in their journeys and then as they arrived to Moldova and Romania? So this chart shows the increase in formal financial accounts coming from Findex. So looking at like 2011, 14. So you can see in 2021, the last round of Findex, 82% of Ukrainian women had a formal account at a financial institution and were using a mobile money account. So this is a very financially included population. We know that a lot of other refugee communities have lower levels of financial inclusion. Again, showing why I think we're really hoping our policy side of this research is saying, like, if Ukrainian women are having a hard time in certain ways with financial services, let's think about all of the other refugee women that might be having more difficulties and more struggles, and what can we do to support them? So even though a lot of these women had formal accounts, they weren't really sure if their accounts were going to be accessible once they crossed the border out of Ukraine. And so 70% we found left with hryvnia, 30% left with US dollars, some left with euros, some left with what they had. Those women who are unbanked, who we found were kind of usually the older women, left with all the cash they had. And so they were traveling and some of them lost that money to people who had like poor intentions. And so this is like, again, really interesting to think what maybe, it sounds like a terrible thing to say, like when your country is being attacked, like what could banks do to ensure that refugees can leave? Like what a crazy thing to say. But I'm also like, what can financial service providers do in the future maybe, or like how do we assure people that if they cross a border, they're going to be able to access their accounts? So maybe they don't have to travel with so much cash unless that's what they have at home and have to leave so quickly. So despite these early concerns that women would not be able to like access their accounts, and if they cross their border with so much cash, 76% of account holders in our sample were able to withdraw funds without issue. So we actually found that women were functioning largely in cash in Moldova and Romania, using their ATM cards to withdraw whatever cash they had in their Ukrainian accounts. And then thinking about like, why would somebody open an account in Romania or Moldova? This was of interest to our organization and others, knowing that livelihoods are drivers of women's usage of formal financial services, and Women's World Banking's working hypothesis is that access to formal financial services goes hand in hand with other potentially useful opportunities, including government aid payments, loans for small business development, mobile money apps, remittance sending and receiving, among others, and these all have impacts on long-term resilience. So I commented in the opening first weeks of the war, we were concerned about a women's ability to open accounts. And in our research, women who tried to open bank accounts in Moldova and Romania were able to do so. Yet we found that most women were withdrawing using ATM cards, and so they weren't really working towards formal financial services in arriving countries. Again, something we're really curious to see if that's changed. Among the women that did open bank accounts, they did so to comply with employers' direct deposit like payment services, or be able to accept transfers from clients if they were self-employed, like the hairdresser that I mentioned. And so finally, as I shared earlier, after a few months of financial access challenges, the European Central Bank issued a letter to the members of the European Parliament, laying out a scheme that guaranteed hryvnia at Ukraine's official exchange rate. This was so important for those people that left with hryvnia and cash, and that's what they had to work with. In turn, the European Banking Authority authorized banks to provide accounts to Ukrainian refugees with alternative forms of or delayed confirmation of identification. Again, something that other refugee groups do not have access to. And this was a truly like amazing effort by the European Central Bank. So here I have some examples of websites of banks that had specific regulation or like guidance on their website for Ukrainians who wish to open accounts. And so there were no banks that we found which blocked Ukrainian women refugees' access to financial services. And here it's worth saying too that we asked women what forms of identification they were carrying with them. And even though people left in, most people left because there were bombings around their house or in their region, most people did leave with like a passport or some form of identification. Again, something that other refugee groups might not have had. So what does this all mean for our research and for us as like a research community in supporting Ukrainian women moving forward? And what information do we as a group need now to continue our work advocating for and coordinating services for Ukrainian refugees? So rebuilding, for anybody intending to return to Ukraine or who have, also the intention to return might have changed in the last 8 months since we talked to women. But we heard particularly heartbreaking stories from people in our sample whose homes were in cities that were then the focus of attacks and continue to be. One woman heard from members of her community still in Ukraine, her home no longer had a roof. Others shared that her home had been bombed, it was no longer habitable. She was wondering, like, she wanted to go home. She knew she didn't have anywhere to go. Multiple women shared they had opened a savings account, what they called the Golden Fund, which was money set aside specifically for their return to Ukraine. And so these are the questions we have currently that I've alluded to. Where are women now? At that time, 84% told us they had plans to return, with an additional 8 saying, like, depending on how the war goes. We also, towards the end of our interviews in June, were already meeting women who were crossing the border really regularly. So they would go into Moldova for social services and then return home at the end of the day. So people were buying like round trip bus tickets, just trying to make it. And we're curious how that has happened. Again, like women who have started to settle in Moldova and Romania, and we're going to pull in Poland as well. Like, have they found formal work? Have they found a place to live that enables them to find formal work? Otherwise, what informal work have they been doing? Have they started businesses? And then thinking too about changing use of financial services. So do more people have formal accounts in receiving countries? What are their savings goals, if any, and what services are now needed? Okay, so concluding, our key messages from this research that there's a lack of communication by Ukrainian banks during the first days of the war on what refugees might need as they left, and like assuring them that they'd have access to their accounts. In the case of Ukrainian women refugees and other forcibly displaced persons or migrants, livelihood needs overlap with a multitude of other concerns, and this especially is true in dependent care in this instance. Financial services are one of many needs, and they could be part of a coordinated response. And then also coordination across EU countries was like an incredibly powerful enabler of access to needed services. So my final slide. So long-term financial resilience is tenuous, especially there was like initial aid, but now as the war has gone on, have aid services changed, and how's women's financial resilience now? And then really wondering about like where these women are. We're going to follow up with the same ones and ask about their jobs So thank you so much for your attention. The team really is happy to be here and share this with you. And we'd like to recognize the MetLife Foundation as our current funder, our current research and key advisors of our work, and the team members that have worked on this project. Great, thank you.
No, thank you, Megan. That was fascinating stuff. Really detailed, yet really sort of clear and concise at the same time. So thank you for that.